Massanutten Mountain. That's Strasburg sits just to the right of there. Front Royal is to the left of Massanutten Mountain. And in the Blue Ridge, you can kind of see it continues down. And the western wall down, follow those power lines down, and you can barely make out the crest of some of the mountains in a couple places beyond the tree line there. Those are the Allegheny Mountains. That's the western wall of the Shenandoah Valley. And up here in the area from here all the way up to the Potomac River, this is the widest part of the Shenandoah Valley, wide open for operation. But it narrows as it heads more in a southwestern fashion here because of the Massanutten Mountain splitting it. On the east side of Massanutten is known as the Page or Luray Valley. Very narrow. That's US Route 340. If you're ever looking for a great drive on a Sunday afternoon, don't go on a day like today, but a day where it's nice and clear. Beautiful vistas all the way down. And you know, you leave the Front Royal area and you're going to emerge down in the area of Port Republic from the 1862 Valley Campaign, and you'll see the southern terminus of Massanutten down there. And again, the main valley, which is a little wider, will be on the west side of Massanutten. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is the Shenandoah Valley, geographically, it's operating to the advantage of the Confederates because it kind of runs from the northeast to southwest, so that when Union troops are, their primary objective, Union's primary objective in Virginia is Richmond, the Confederate capital. Well, if you're operating in the Shenandoah Valley and you're starting from the northern end, as you march through it, which we'll say up the valley, you're moving away, farther away from Richmond. Now, Confederates, on the other hand, such as Jubal A in July of 1864, as he comes down the Shenandoah Valley from Lynchburg and then Stanton, as he moves through the valley, it's angling north and east, so he's actually getting closer to Washington, D.C. So strategically, in big picture here, the valley's not cooperative with the war aims of the Union troops in Virginia. So we've gone over everything in terms of the campaigns that have occurred here, which is a little bit here. Pritchard's Hill, where we're standing now, was the scene of 4 engagements during the Civil War. 2 of them, most of us are pretty well familiar with. The 1862 Battle of Kernstown, where troops under the command of Colonel Nathan Kimball defeated Stonewall Jackson in his only defeat on March 23rd of 1862. The battle that we're going to be talking about today, Second Kernstown. But there was also a preliminary engagement here at the Second Battle of Winchester in June of 1863. And ironically, in June of 1863, the commander of the division of troops that was operating here was General Jubal A. And he comes up with a plan. He meets Union resistance here on Pritchard's Hill and behind the stone walls there. Comes up, fronts up against him, sends the Louisiana Brigade up onto Sandy Ridge, that wooded ridge to the west, to my left, your right, and flanks them out of this position. Now here's the irony. I want to tell you a little comparison between June of 1863 and July of 1864. Jubal A commanded a division from the Second Army Corps that numbered about 8,000 men. This is prior to Gettysburg, in the wilderness and all that. After all that stuff happens, in July of 1864, Jubal A commands 3 divisions from the Second Corps in 1864 here. Those 3 divisions only number 8,000 men. So although technically, in terms of what he is commanding, it's the same size numerically in terms of the number of men. He does have reinforced other troops that were Valley troops. I'm just focusing on the Army of Northern Virginia troops. But it just shows you that the Corps in 1863 numbered about 25,000 men. And now that entire Corps is 8,000 men, which was the same size as the division Early commanded during going into the Gettysburg campaign, to show you the scope of the attrition. Now, Jubal Early's rebuilt the Second Corps, and although it's down in numbers, its combat effectiveness has remained. These men have stayed with the Army and knew how to fight, and actually going to Lynchburg and going to Maryland gets them out of that day-to-day grind of the overland, the Cold Harbor, and then the daily combats at Petersburg and Richmond. So he's kind of rebuilds the Second Corps. New crop of younger rising officers. In some cases, many of them were as capable or more capable than the men that succeeded them. He'll have some first-rate combat leaders here in John Gordon and John C. Breckinridge, former Vice President of the United States, and Stephen D. Ramseur, a young North Carolinian who's very aggressive. Old Jube's just got to know when to take the leash off and let him go, because he can get into trouble if he goes off on his own hook. So the first combat that is seen from here is going to be on the 23rd. Early's cavalry is going to break through and push back Dufie's Union cavalry towards Kernstown, and Crook is going to send Mulligan and Rutherford B. Hayes down to Kernstown to beef up the cavalry. Mulligan's going to send out some patrols, get mostly information from the cavalry, but Mulligan's pretty well convinced from what they've learned that the Confederates are here in force, which is accurate information. Crook doesn't think so, and he's going to pull, he actually has sent Thoburn's division as well over to Sandy Ridge that day on the 23rd. He will leave Mulligan here at Kernstown with Dufie's cavalry, but he's going to pull Hayes and Thoburn back to Winchester. So I think Crook, remember I mentioned that he had assessed it properly on the 22nd. I think by the morning of the 23rd, when he's going to suddenly get more warnings from Kernstown that the enemy's advancing in force, he's like, not this again. And again, I think it has as much to do with none of these guys were Crook's trusted subordinates. He didn't have Hayes, he didn't have Duval, he didn't have Thoburn giving him the report. It was coming from Mulligan, who was an unknown. Averill had a reputation as having failed on several occasions, and Dufier was just generally known as an unreliable quantity. So he's kind of souring on the messengers, and unfortunately, he's missing an accurate message. You know, he's like, oh, I just had the whole army out yesterday, now I got to pull them back. But anyway, skirmishing will start early in the morning on the north side of Stevens City, which was known as Newtown in 1864. And it will be Dufie's cavalry down at where Opequon Creek crosses the Valley Pike. They'll be driven back here, and Mulligan and his men are up here on Pritchard's Hill. Again, he's got about 1,800 men, you know, spread out. Most of them just camp, pickets out in front. Secure that, you know, Dufie's cavalry is in the vanguard, and, you know, they'll have advance notice if anything is going to happen. And so it's early in the morning, they hear the picket shots, and Mulligan and his men, again, Mulligan was a devout Roman Catholic, and at this point in the war, he was much troubled by the fact that the priest had resigned, who was their chaplain, and they didn't have anybody to say a mass for them that Sunday morning. You know, in general, he's not supposed to do that one, but so they did their best with their prayer books and their rosary beads, and you know, and then they hear the gunfire breaking out. You know, some of the men, as I said before, Mulligan's men hadn't had a lot of experience. His headquarters staff was kind of close-knit. It included his wife's younger brother, 19-year-old Lieutenant James Nugent, and another nephew there as well that was on the staff. And his nephew recalled that when some of the men were got a little nervous up here and started asking questions, Mulligan kind of took a light air to himself, and he pulled a cigar out of the headquarters wagon there, and his nephew noted, you know, it was all the more funny and entertaining to the men because Mulligan did not smoke and he did not drink. So he just said, with a Broadway smile, he just, you know, he put that cigar in his mouth. He didn't light it up, but he was just having some fun with the men, trying to lighten their hearts. Now, as the cavalry begins to get closer, Mulligan is going to start pushing troops out into the field. You see the townhouses over there? There, beyond there through the trees is Opequon Church. And if you look off in the distance, you see the big white industrial building. That was known as Varden's Wood. And it wasn't necessarily wide in terms of like east to west. And I'm going to use terms east and west and north and south in the valley, even though we're slightly off in terms of the actual juxtaposition there. It wasn't that wide, but it was deep, and it provided a lot of cover for Confederate troops as they're moving onto the battlefield. So they're going to be initially skirmishing with Confederate cavalry. Cavalry is going to be primarily, you have John McCausland's brigade moving north up Route 345-22. He cuts over, everyone know where Dinosaur Land is?
Yep.
He cuts over from the Valley Pike and then heads north at Dinosaur Land, coming in on that flank. John and Bowden's on the back road, a couple miles west of where we're at, moving forward. And yeah, you can see this here on the maps. I apologize for not pointing that out. Bradley Johnson, that's where McCausland is with Bradley Johnson, both of those cavalry brigades. But what do you see of this? And then you see the heart of the army is following John C. Vaughn's brigade forward up the Valley Pike. A man by the name of Colonel William L. Jackson, better known as Mudwall Jackson, a cousin of Stonewall Jackson, who was given his nickname, as George Crook noted, in contradistinction to his more esteemed cousin. Mudwall did the best that he could with the small force of cavalry that he did, but he's going to spearhead the assault and be driving back Dufier's men right out on the middle road. Just, you see the green church over there, the green roof, directly over there? Middle road runs right in front of that. So that's where Mudwall's going to be moving up towards Kernstown there. John C. Vaughn's men, the Tennesseans and Georgians, will occupy those woods, Varden's Woods. Yes, sir.
So are the cavalry fighting mounted or dismounted? Or
What's happening is the cavalry's got dismounted pickets out, and they'll fire a bit, and then they'll fall back. We're not getting into any close quarters cavalry. The day before, there was some of that close quarters cavalry action taking place. You know where Alamo Drafthouse Cinema is, down where 37 and 81 come together? Down in that area is where there was some more swirling cavalry action, and they drove the Union troops almost all the way back to Kernstown that afternoon. But this warning at this point, they're the pickets and they're not being overextended. They just want to delay and fall back. Dufier is going to send word north to his 2nd Brigade and bring another brigade forward to strengthen the line. Mulligan's men will advance down. Some of them, where you see trees, that was all open ground around the Pritchard farm and the church, all the way out to the pike. There was a few houses there, but there was no cover. So when Mulligan's men move out there, they're going to take over the skirmish line from the cavalry about mid-morning there, and be shooting back and forth, trading shots with the Tennesseans. Those Tennesseans will head out and join Mulligan and, McCausland and Johnson over on the Front Royal Winchester Pike, Route 340 at 522, and joined them. But who's going to take over there is Major General John B. Gordon. He's one of these young, up-and-coming, recently promoted to division command in the summer of 1864. He's the hero at the Battle of Monocacy. It's his troops that are going to turn the tide of battle there and drive the Yankees from the field. And he's always been a very aggressive, hard-hitting guy. And his men are going to take over the fight. Now, one of the things I'd like to talk about how the Confederates are fighting out here in the valley. There is a fully organized corps of Confederate sharpshooters that are very effective. In fact, Colonel Joseph Thoburn, in his journal in this campaign, writes praisingly of these Confederate sharpshooters, and he lamented that there was no such corps within the ranks of our own army. But these men were chosen, 2 men from each company in each regiment in Early's army, because they were the best shots. These were the guys who've probably been hunting since they were 4 or 5 years old, and they know how to handle a rifle. Contrary to a lot of legend and misinformation, they were not carrying the imported English Whitworth sharpshooting rifles. They were using Enfield rifles. Sometimes they were even using a shorter version of the Enfield so that they could lay down and they could more easily load it. But they're very adept at what they do. And Mulligan's men are going to feel the effects the instant the sharpshooters take over the firing line from the Tennessee cavalry. Right away, Mulligan's men, they start taking casualties, officers start getting picked off. And that happens probably about 11 o'clock in the morning here. Let's see, move us up to another map here. So you can kind of see this deployment, where before on the second page, the one titled Map 1, don't worry about the arrows at this point. Not all of the troops are in position, but Gordon's division is moving into position down there around the church and south of the church and in Barton Wood. So they see that. Mulligan is going to send his brother-in-law, James Nugent, north to Winchester. And young Nugent is telling Crook what's going on, and there's all this firing coming in from the front, and Crook's kind of like, again, I'm trying to set Crook up and portray him, give you his perspective on it. He just sent out 2 divisions the day before and nothing happened, and he recalled most of them back to Winchester, and then he's thinking in his mind, now you guys are telling me the same thing, And he says, well, I haven't heard a half a dozen shots from the front yet today, young man. And Nugent says, well, General, if you were a little closer to the front, you would have heard at least a dozen. And Crook didn't like that. He says, you go tell Colonel Mulligan to instantly and persistently advance and to drive off those bushwhackers. And he says, I'll deal with you tomorrow. And so Nugent comes back and relays the information to Mulligan. Now Crook, at the same time, I'm going to have you, we're going to switch over to an earlier map that'll give you a better. Now let's just go back to the first map. So Crook's up there around Bowers Hill at Winchester. And down here at Kernstown, at Kernstown we've got Mulligan and Gordon's men and the cavalry deploying and maneuvering as the combat is growing. At that point, after he gets this message, Crook decides, well, you know what, there probably is a big reconnaissance in force, maybe a full division of infantry with the cavalry. So Crook says, what I'm going to do, I'm going to send Averell's division down the Front Royal Road with 1,800 men, and he's headed towards about 4,000 cavalry under the command of Vaughn, 3 brigades, Vaughn's own brigade, McCausland and Johnson. So, but Crook envisions that what they're going to do is the cavalry is going to come around here. He's assuming there's no one out there to oppose them. And then they're going to cut in behind Early's army at Stevens City, which is off the map down here. And he's sending Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes' division down to reinforce Mulligan. Thoburn is being sent over to where he was the day before on Sandy Ridge. And they're going to push south, and Thoburn's going to sweep in and hit Sandy Ridge from the west. Mulligan's going to come in from the north side, and Hayes is going to swing around from the east. They're going to retreat into a panic into the waiting arms of Averell's cavalry division. Well, Crook has completely misjudged not only the strength and magnitude of the Confederate deployment, but in terms of this cavalry movement, the time-distance factor. You know, there's no way they're going to be lucky to get around there in time to do that, even if they are unopposed. We'll come back to that later, because what's going to happen here on the battlefield is Colonel Mulligan's men are going to struggle to find a position. Ultimately, they're going to fall back behind the stone wall here, which extended out towards the Valley Pike, and take cover there and have some skirmishers out in the field. In the meantime, Jubal Early's army is going to build up its strength. Early is going to demonstrate some remarkable command flexibility. His plan is, I'm going to send Stephen D. Ramseur. I'm going to send Stephen D. Ramseur out to the west to Sandy Ridge, and just like I did in 1863, I'm going to flank the Union out of off of their position from Sandy Ridge. Well, while that's going on, you know, over there, look down behind the townhouses, you'll see, I think it's a cement mixing plant, industrial towers beyond there. John C. Breckinridge, one of his divisions, he commands, he's the corps commander of Gordon and Gabriel Wharton. General Gabriel Wharton's troops are from southwest Virginia. They had fought at Newmarket, Piedmont, and Lynchburg, and when Early comes to Lynchburg, they become an element of his command. Well, Breckinridge, in early January 2nd of 1863 at the Battle of Stones River, Braxton Bragg ordered him to make an assault against a strong Union position. Well, Breckinridge followed his orders. It turns out there was batteries, massive position of Union artillery on the ridge that they had not noticed before, and his division is going to be slaughtered and fall back, taking heavy loss. Breckinridge said from that point forward, he always made it a point to do a personal reconnaissance in front of his command before ordering his troops forward. He does that out over on that ridge where Interstate 81 is, and he sees there's nothing there. There's a few cavalry on the ridge. Rutherford B. Hayes' brigade is not even in position yet, but he sees that it's wide open. He reports this to Jubal Early, and old Jube gives him the go-ahead to move his troops into position over there. And from there, with nearly 3,000, mostly Virginians, but a regiment called the Thomas Legion, just primarily North Carolina mountaineers, and maybe a few East Tennesseans thrown in for good measure, they will launch the key blow of this fight. So, what we're going to do next is probably a very welcome maneuver on our part. We're going to head down and we're going to pick up the interpretation from the shade of the trees along Pritchard's Hill.
Couple questions.
Yes.
When Nugent met with Crook, how many troops, Union troops, were here right
So
now?
you had, at that point, you had 1,800 in Mulligan's division, and one brigade, probably about 1,000 men of the cavalry, with a few hundred more cavalry on their way to deploy.
And how long of a line were they covering?
Well, they're not. You had more cavalry had been out in front. Some of the cavalry is screening, you know, small elements of the command on the back road, the middle road, you know, in front of Jackson here, but there's nothing over on the left. The infantry line extends. The right flank probably rested in the lane just beyond the Pritchard buildings there, the white buildings there, and extended out to the Valley Pike. There's probably a squadron of cavalry over there. Early in the morning too, we know that there's only one battery of artillery here, Battery E, 1st West Virginia Light Artillery, the Upshur County Battery, and they were in position up here on this hill. So there's a lot of Confederates coming at that rather small force.
So if Crook had sent the rest of his troops, they might have had a chance?
Yeah. I suspect if he knew the magnitude of what was coming, he wouldn't have wanted to fight here. You know, he probably would have prudently fallen back, you know, at this point. But he's gonna miss his warning. He had to make a decision at that point, and he decided that based upon the actions of the 2 previous days, that it's probably a reconnaissance in force, and you know that he was gonna fight it out.
So he probably did the worst thing.
Yeah, because I said, again, this is the widest point of the valley, and another thing with the Union cavalry is they are exceedingly worn down in numbers. From Averell's division at the end of April marched from Charleston, West Virginia, and again, this is through muddy spring rains and freezing cold nights, to Wytheville, then up to Christiansburg, Blacksburg, back into the mountains. Then they came to Stanton, and then they went to Lynchburg, then back, and they just lost so many horses. In comparison, Early picks up a lot of horses when he goes into Maryland, and you know, he added in a full brigade of mounted Tennesseans who, when they had been serving as infantry during the Maryland raid, and their horses came up and were waiting for them in Winchester when they fell back from Washington, D.C. So his cavalry is up over 5,000 in strength. And one thing, if you've done any reading on especially the fall Sheridan Early campaign, you've probably heard about the Valley Cavalry under Early, how ineffective it was. Well, at that point in the war, when Sheridan brought 8,000 cavalry with him, yes, they were outgunned, outhorsed, and outmanned. But in the summer of 1864, fighting against, you know, Crook's Army of West Virginia, Hunter's Army of West Virginia, and Sigel's as the commanders, they generally gave as good as they got or better against the Union cavalry out here in the valley. And it was only when those guys from the Army of the Potomac came in, those 2 divisions under Custer and Merritt, that they were completely unmatched.
Do we have any idea what the weather was?
Yeah, it was cooler than today. You know, it was in the 80s, the mid 80s. You know, it did. I was funny because I was just looking. Bob Crick, he wrote a book years ago, basically just recording all the weather readings from Washington D.C. and Richmond, which could give you a good idea as to what it was.
You mentioned a couple political notorieties in terms of what and Breckinridge. Garfield at this encounter?
No, Garfield was not, but William McKinley was on Hayes' staff. Yeah, and we'll have a good William McKinley story as we wrap up the battle.
What about the morale of the Confederates? They had marched all the way to Washington, D.C. just to stop and look at the dome, and then they had to march all the way back.
It's pretty high. You know, you know, some I can't remember who exactly this was. I think it was a staff officer or one of the brigade commanders wrote a letter home, and he was addressing the criticisms of Jubal Early for not capturing Washington. And he said something along the lines of, hey, he's the only man who ever gave me a view of the Yankee capital. the other thing is what does he do with Washington, D.C. once he captures it? He knows the night he arrives, his cavalry had ranged up northward into the suburbs of Baltimore, and he gets the message back from some captured dispatches that 2 corps were on their way to Washington. The 6th Corps had already started arriving and filtering into the forts on the 11th. The 19th Corps, only about 5,000 men, but between when the entire 6th Corps was reunited and there's over 15,000, there's more men and reinforcements coming. And then Early also knew that Hunter's Army of West Virginia, it was coming east. They knew that. They knew at some point they were going to have that 15,000 man force coming in. And the one thing that Early did not want to have happen is he doesn't want to get trapped north of the Potomac River with forces in both directions. As it was, I'll give you an example. On July 16th, this is how close he comes to being captured. He rests his army at around Leesburg for a couple of days. On July 16th, he starts heading west, what's today Route 7, through the Blue Ridge. As his army is passing through Purcellville, the town of Purcellville, half of the army in front of it, the wagon train in the middle, and the other half in the rear. The vanguard of George Crook's army, Colonel William B. Tibbetts, about 400 men cavalry detachment, launches an attack on the wagon train, capturing and destroying about 100 wagons or so and hauling off probably about 40, 50 prisoners before Confederate reinforcements come up and drive them off. So if Early had dallied just a little bit more, the rest of Crook's army was probably about 8 miles north of there at Hillsboro, Virginia. So it was a close run thing as it was. So Early was pretty prudent. And going back to the morale, men were joking. They were saying, yeah, when we get in there, if we get in there, we could capture Lake Lincoln, and we'll install John C. Breckinridge as President of the United States Senate again. He had previously been Vice President of the United States and a senator from Kentucky. So I think from what I saw from the contemporary correspondence, it was mostly positive. Stephen D. Ramseur is the division commander who wrote back to his wife defending Early when he came under criticism from, called them newspaper men and stay-at-home croakers, something like that. Well, let's head down to the stone wall.